So good evening and welcome to our Historical Society program. I'm Kathy Cavallari. I'm the president of the Westborough Historical Society. I'm delighted you've joined us this evening. The Westborough Historical Society was founded in 1889 to preserve and celebrate local history through research programs and the preservation of artifacts. Our headquarters is at the Sibley House, an 1844 Greek Revival home built by the slaymaker, William Sibley, located at 13 Parkman Street. And in the house, we do have 3 centuries of artifacts dating back to the founding of the town and the Revolutionary War. For more than a century, the Society's mission has been to celebrate local history and bring that history to life through our monthly presentations, Sibley House tours, which we hope to resume in the spring, and special events. So if you enjoyed tonight's program, we encourage you to like our Facebook page, which is Westborough Historical Society, and check out our website, www.westboroughhistory.org, and consider becoming a member through our website. Our presenter tonight is Tom Morgan. Let's see here. Tom tells me that he is actually a newbie to Westborough, having only lived here for 44 years. For much of that time, he says he was known in town as Donna Morgan's husband, as their 3 children went through the Westborough schools, and I just want to say my husband can relate to that. He's been a member of the Congregational Church for 42 of the 44 years, and is currently the interim church historian. His interest in the religions in Westborough began when he found out that the First Baptist Church in our town ended up in Woodville, which is the northern part of Hopkinton. Tom has been involved with Westborough Public Access Television, the Westborough TV that's recording us tonight, since 1994 as a producer and later on the board of directors. During the pandemic, since he's a bit of a computer guru, he developed the Congregational Church's multi-computer video center to support live streaming for hybrid worship services and church committee meetings. Tom has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Yale and an MBA from Babson. He retired in 2013 after nearly 40 years as at both Data General and then EMC. As a manager in the integration of computers and storage to create backup products for open systems and mainframes. But lucky for us, he enjoys researching religious history as a hobby, so we're going to benefit from that. And just a reminder, any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat, and I will relate them to Tom at the end of the presentation. So now I turn it over to Tom Morgan. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks very much. So let me begin our screen sharing here. So keeping in the Puritan tradition, these are very plain slides, but good evening.
Recording in progress.
Good evening to everyone, and very pleased that you've all chosen to spend some time kind of walking through roughly 300 years of Westborough history in 34 slides. I think most of you are aware that the town began with a single Puritan church in colonial times, and that today I think we're now at 13 active houses of worship, and hence the byline, the tagline here: first one, now many. I began putting these talks together along this topic for the confirmands at the Congregational Church, the youth who were considering joining the church. And so we were kind of giving them a whole series of lessons, introductions, whatever, to not only the church theology, but also the history of the church. And I thought that many of them, given that they had an attachment to our church, might in fact kind of have associates on their own who might have similar interests, although not necessarily with our church, but with some other of the houses of worship in town. And it could well be the same for many of you who are either interested or perhaps deeply involved in one of the congregations in town or another. To that end, the earlier versions of this talk that I had, the byline was, "We pass by our history every day," because it struck me all the places in town that we sort of zoom by on the way through the Rotary and others that in fact have historical significance for faith communities. And so that's the goal here, is to kind of impart some of the things that I've come across and learned that connect the faith communities in Westborough, first from the first single town church, now to the over about 13 houses of worship in town. So I want to first just briefly acknowledge that I didn't do all this myself. There are some real historians who are on this acknowledgments list, and I am grateful for many of the resources which are now online, made the research infinitely easier. And I do want to acknowledge the Westborough Historical Society for sponsoring this presentation. So let's talk about the Puritans. We have to, because that's kind of where the town began, out of that tradition. But I think it's also important to put the Puritans in their own context and time. Now, yeah, we know that the Puritans were Protestants. Their movement arose in the late 16th century within the Church of England. But just to recap, the Church of England was started by Henry VIII as a way of breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And it over time, it sort of swung either toward Catholicism or Protestantism, sort of depending on who was on the throne of England at the time. Elizabeth I was raised a Catholic. She had actually quite a bit of impact on the eventual shape and traditions that were in the Church of England. For example, the choice for that the Puritans took. Now, the Puritans basically, as it indicates here, wanted to simplify even that aspect of the Church of England, the doctrine and the worship practices. And for example, they chose to have their clergy wear black rather than the white vestments that were traditional in the Catholic Church. And that's carried forward in many congregations today. The civil governance was dictated by the clergy based on Puritan principles. So basically, the Puritans established a church state based around the Puritan principles. Church governance was interestingly decided by local congregations and not necessarily by an ecclesiastical hierarchy like bishops and archbishops. But they did insist on strictness in religious discipline and home life as well. One of the characteristics of their outlook was that every public danger and everything that bad happened came because God was unhappy with what people were doing, the people were doing. And as a result, there were often fasts and other signs of penance that were declared by the clergy as a way to show God that people understood he was not happy, or she was not happy with, he at the time, with what the people were doing, and that they repented. But there were trials, even death, for nonconformists, because the Puritans, while they wanted religious freedom, and that's the reason why they came to the Salem and eventually Boston areas, they were not interested in religious freedom for anybody else. So they had the habit of really persecuting Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers, and eventually what happened was that the crown in England became so unhappy with the persecution that the Puritans were doing of these other religions that they revoked the charter for Massachusetts Bay Colony in the late 1600s. So it was very interesting, and I also kind of find it interesting to, you know, some people say that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So if we think about some of the most current events that are happening in other parts of the globe, kind of look down the list here of the characteristics of the Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony, I think we see some things that rhyme and kind of make you wonder. But the result, as I say, was the town-supported ministers and churches, town-supported, tax-supported, for nearly 200 years as a result of this Puritan beginning. Now, we have to also talk about how Westborough itself arose. Marlborough was an area in central Massachusetts that was settled in 1657. It was resettled multiple times because it frequently was being burned down by unhappy Indians. But next to Marlborough was this area called Chauncey, and that was given by the colony to Charles Chauncey in 1659. Charles Chauncey was an educator, a clergyman, and secondarily a physician. He was the second president of Harvard College. Harvard had been established in 1636 to educate Puritan clergymen. That was the role of Harvard. And Chauncey was the president until his death in 1672. But the colony owed him some money because he really didn't get paid very much for being the president of Harvard. So they granted him this area around what we now call Lake Chauncey, named Chauncey, and as a way of settling that debt. Eventually, the town of Marlborough said, you know, we'd really like to annex the Chauncey area and have it added, and that was approved by the council. So one might say, all right, well, that's cool, but why did people settle in Westborough in the first place? What is it that attracted them? And this map kind of shows a couple of the key reasons. Now, there were no permanent Indian settlements in this area. There was seasonal hunting and seasonal camps and things like that, but it wasn't that there were any permanent villages here. However, in this area, there were a couple of major trails that were ancient that intersected right near where we are. One of these was the old Connecticut path, which led down toward Hartford from the Bay Area. And the other was the Narragansett path, Narragansett Trail, which went north and south up into Canada. So these became easy trade routes and transportation routes for the European settlers as they moved into this area. And note that this Narragansett Trail is most likely the route that was taken by the Indians who kidnapped the Rice Boys in 1704. So basically, Westborough was already sort of a central area. So taking advantage of these trails, the Puritan missionaries in the late 1600s began to proselytize and try to propagate their faith out into central Massachusetts. One of the ways in which they did that was to establish about a dozen settlements known as praying villages. And these were Indian settlements that were converted to Christianity by folks like John Eliot in the late 1600s. And notable among them in our area were Grafton, Natick, Hopkinton, Ashland, and among those dozen. And in fact, in Grafton, there is still a plot which belongs to the Nipmuc nations and is maintained by them and maintained by the town for them. So there's still some evidence today. However, most of these praying villages were disbanded during King Philip's War in the late 1600s, which was a bloody Indian uprising. And it sort of soured the relationships there, to say the least. So timelines are interesting, and here I put together a timeline that depicts kind of things that happened before the charter for Westborough was actually granted in 1717. And one of the things that was going on here is that there were wars in Europe which had reflections into North America, because the parties in Europe that were at war, England, France, Spain, all had possessions in North America. And as a consequence, those conflicts, sort of bled over and led to conflicts here in North America. What this timeline shows is a couple of things. Number one, the block shows the point in time following a couple of wars where the charter was granted. It also blocks out things that happened afterward, because what I wanted to do is kind of say, let's put ourselves in the knowledge base, if you will, of the Westborough settlers at that time. A lot of the worst of the wars seemed to be over for a while. A number of the Indian conflicts, like that which led to Mary Goodnell's killing in Marlborough, were basically abated. So it seemed like a good time to establish a town here in Westborough. They really couldn't see, as they're kind of blocked out here, they couldn't see what was coming. But some things that we can appreciate now, which followed, and notably like the French and Indian War, and eventually the Revolutionary War. So there was more conflict in store for Westborough, but it was a period of relative peace during this time, and fostered good growth in this area. The original Westborough was the West Borough of Marlborough, and it was centered around Lake Chauncey. The original Westborough included Northborough as well as today's Westborough. And then there were parts of the surrounding areas from Shrewsbury and Sutton that were kind of added in. The map indicates where the meeting house was, because in order to be a town at the time, townspeople were required to do two things. They had to build a meeting house, which served both as a church and a town meeting house. And they had to hire and pay a pastor, those two requirements. So in 1717, late 1717, Westborough was granted a charter and incorporated, and they selected an area very close to Lake Chauncey as where they were going to build the meeting house. This was off Oak Street, today's Oak Street, in an area called Powder Hill. It's very near Spectrum House, right in that area today. One of the parts of their governance was that only church members could vote in town affairs, and as a result, the town and the church records from those periods are essentially right together and the same set of records. Now, the first meeting of the town was actually called in early 1718, and there was a gentleman named Daniel Elmer who had been apparently preaching in this area, and the minutes from that first town meeting indicated that the members said, all right, let's call this Daniel Elmer to be our pastor. Let's get moving here. Elmer was a 1713 graduate of Yale, sometime before my time. But as I said, he'd been preaching in the town already. He was given the title to the 50-acre ministerial farm, which was also part of the requirement that when a town wanted to form, they had to reserve a plot of land and give it forever to the pastor to own. It turns out, though, that Elmer really didn't mesh well with the town or the ecclesiastical council that kind of was in place to approve such folks to be permanent pastors. So he was not accepted by this council, and as a result did not become truly the first settled pastor of the town. So as that happened, he said, well, later for this, he sold the 50-acre farm and moved to Springfield and then on to Connecticut. So for a number of years, actually, Westborough was without a pastor. Finally, in about 1724, almost 6 years after the town had been chartered, the townspeople finally completed the first meeting house near Lake Chauncey. What's shown here from the records is a sketch of what that meeting house was, we expected that it looked like. About a story and a half high, 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, and as I say, it was located at that time on what is today Oak Street, near Spectrum House. And in 1724, Ebenezer Parkman apparently had been preaching a bit in this area and was known to the town. Parkman was born in Boston. He went into Harvard College at age 14 to become a Puritan clergyman, and was actually preached and then ordained here in October of 1724 at the tender age of 21. And he served as our town minister until he died in 1782, an extremely long stretch. His original pulpit, which is shown in the picture here, is in the Parkman Chapel at the Congregational Church, and that chapel is actually sized to the dimensions of that first meeting house. So if you're familiar with it or have a chance to visit that, it'll give you some idea of what that first meeting house was sized at and what it was like. And in the view of that I'm on here, just over my shoulder, back this way, you can see in the distance that that first pulpit inside the chapel. Now, interestingly enough, in Hopkinton, in July of 1724, just prior to Parkman being settled here in Westborough, Hopkins settled a pastor named Samuel Barrett. Now, Barrett apparently was a colleague and a close friend from Harvard of Ebenezer Parkman, and as early as 1719, Barrett is mentioned in Parkman's diary. Parkman basically kept a diary, by the way, from the late 17 teens until his death in 1782. And Barrett is mentioned frequently there. Similar to Ebenezer Parkman, Barrett served there until his death, which was in 1772. And from a society or social perspective, the records show that both Parkman and Barrett had slaves. Parkman had one for a short time, maybe a year, but Barrett had several. The congregation in the town grew, and in about 24, 25 years, that first meeting house, even though it had been outfitted and worked on, was just too small for the congregation. So they decided in 1748 that they would construct a new or second meeting house. By that time, the commerce of town had really grown nearer to the junction of the trails that was shown in one of those earlier maps, and the roads that had been developed, east and west roads like the Boston Turnpike. And it turned out that the location that was chosen is on what is today the Westborough Rotary. In order to have materials to complete the building of that second meeting house, they were reluctant, but the people ended up tearing down the first meeting house so that they had building materials to complete the second meeting house. Now, over time, that second meeting house itself was enlarged to handle future growth, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And part of Parkman's employment contract with the town, if you will. Excuse me a second. Lord. Oh. Can't mute them all. Part of his employment contract with the town was that if the town ever relocated the meeting house to another part of town, and that was more than a mile from where his first parsonage was, which was right next to the first meeting house, the town would provide him a new second parsonage. So the area in the immediate center of town for the second meeting house was in fact more than a mile, and so the town built him a second parsonage. The site of that was where the mobile station is on West Main Street, the original site. Later, that parsonage was purchased, moved up the hill, still exists at the top of the hill. One of the complaints that the townspeople had about the design for the parsonage that Parkman chose was that the windows were unseemly large for a pastor to have. And I think later on, Parkman says, yeah, they were right. I probably shouldn't have done that, but the windows were the windows that they are. But the parsonage still exists today. So around 1776, given where the new meeting house was in then Westborough, the town that had been relocated south, the church members in the northern part of the town grew tired of the long trip to church and the town meetings. In fact, having to go to Marlborough was one of the reasons that the Westborough settlers said, let's set our own town. That's a long way to go to Marlborough for church and meetings. So the same kind of realization dawned upon the people in Northborough, the north part of Westborough. So they petitioned to have a town of their own called, strangely enough, Northborough. That was recognized in 1776. This map shows where that second meeting house is with respect to the borders of Westborough, which have not changed since 1766. During Parkman's pastorate, there were a number of important events. One of these was a social and, if you will, a religious movement that, in retrospect, historians call the First Great Awakening. Roughly in the 1730 to 1755 period is when this was active. And it was really a widespread revitalization movement and evangelicalism that took hold, and a pulling away from ritual and sacramentalism and church hierarchy. And it began to make Christianity a much more intensely personal religion for the average person. In part, this was driven by multiple diphtheria epidemics in the early 1740s, and Westborough and Boston suffered greatly from these epidemics. Now, I mentioned before that calamities such as this were seen and termed to be retribution from the divine for things that the townspeople and people were not doing correctly. And so as a result, fasting and praying and so forth were the response to try to show penance. But with this diphtheria epidemic, fasting and praying had precious little effect. And in fact, it was once the sources of diphtheria were identified, it was determined that the practices for dealing with diphtheria patients, like having them all get in the same room with the children, were contributing to the intensity of the epidemic. Interestingly enough, once the sources were eventually found, there were a whole series of changes in both public health and personal practices, which we take for granted today, like sewers, like town water systems, like using bed sheets. So there were some, if you will, positive effects that came out of that. One of the effects, though, was that it began to shake the faith, if you will, that the townspeople in the congregations had in the leadership of these local ministers like Parkman. And Parkman notes in his diary that around this period of time, some of the leading parishioners came to him and said, the people are not happy with kind of the direction you're taking them in and counseling them to take. And some of these preachers like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and others who were, gave eventually rise to the Baptist and Methodist movements, they kind of sowed discontent, if you will, or at least alternate views of relationship to the divine and the clergy than what the Puritans had advocated. So Parkman listened, thought about it, but basically, as far as we know, really didn't substantially change his Puritan outlook for the rest of his pastorate here. However, in the South, mainly in the south of the colonies, this strengthened Baptists and Methodists, which in fact did eventually have an impact on Westborough. Parkman died, as I mentioned, in I think 1782. Shortly after that, there was a movement known as the Second Great Awakening, which was longer. It went from the late 1790s and 1700s into the middle of the 1800s. And these were really led by these Baptist and Methodist preachers. And there was rapidly rising membership in those kinds of congregations. There were also social changes that arose during this period, like the establishment of the YMCA, Sunday schools, the end of slavery in Massachusetts. You remember the Amistad Rebellion, the ship of slaves. That all happened kind of during this period. And many of the converts began to believe that this Second Awakening heralded a new age, and that they need to be ready for the second coming of Christ, which many of them believed was going to be imminent. Some of the changes that happened in Massachusetts during this period, in 1811, it was no longer required that town ministers, like Parkman had been and others, they were no longer required to be supported by taxpayers. And shortly after, in 1825, the formal separation of church and state that had been instituted by the Puritans in the 1600s, that finally was ended. So what happened? So as a result, a couple of major things happened here. Within the town and within the previously single town church, Unitarians, Trinitarians, and Baptists began to divide. And also, there were formation within the area of Methodist, Catholic, and Second Adventist congregations. So this was really a watershed for the history of the previous single town church, and really set the stage, if you will, given the title of our talk here tonight, for this evolution of religions. One of the interesting things that did occur, though, in Westborough is when Parkman died, the pulpit was empty, and the town began to search for another town minister at that time. But the vote on who would actually be called as the town minister was opened to everyone in town, whether they were members of the church or not. And this was considered to be a very early example of direct democracy, the leading to all town meetings and things like that. So it was a notable event, that a departure, if you will, from the practices in the Puritan church. So in 1816, soon after the requirement to pay taxes to support the town minister was dispensed with, the Baptists left the town church. A group of Baptists left the town church. And they built their first church at the corner of Lyman Street and East Main Street, effectively across the street from where the Willows is today, and I think there's a medical practice building right on that corner. And in about 20 years later, as their congregation grew, they sold that building to a group of Baptists in the Woodville area of Hopkinton. And it was, in fact, a personal thing. This is the event that kind of got me saying, this is a very interesting history of churches and congregations and buildings here in Westborough. Because those of you who are familiar with Hopkinton, Woodville is that section of Route 135 beyond the dump and before you go to Hopkinton, where the speed limit goes now to 25. And if you haven't noticed that, you probably should. The building here from Westborough was disassembled, and in the winter, when the Cedar Swamp was frozen over, it was put on sledges dragged by oxen and taken from where the First Baptist Church had been located on Lyman Street across Cedar Swamp over to Woodville. And those locations are shown on the map here. So that church was reconstructed when we first moved to Westborough. In fact, even into the 1990s, that original church was still there beside Route 135. But eventually their congregation was not able to support it. So due to deterioration, they tore that building down, the one over in Woodville. It was replaced by a smaller chapel, and the building and its organization is now a conference center, effectively. To replace that church that had been sold and moved to Woodville, the Baptists built a second meeting house right next on Main Street, right next to what is now the town hall. And that building was eventually sold to the Catholics as they established the St. Luke's Parish. That building was moved and was replaced with the present structure on that site in 1869. So there's a lot of movement of churches that occurred. Fascinating technology. This is a depiction from one of the historical books that illustrates what West Main Street was like in 1828. Now you can see on the right-hand side is the second meeting house, and again I'll talk a little bit more about its structure. Next to it, just to the left, is the Breck Parkman store. Breck Parkman was one of Ebenezer Parkman's sons, was a very successful businessman, and had a store, a major store here in the Westborough area for many years. Just next to that is shown the schoolhouse that was set up in Westborough. That is the site of Westborough TV's building today on Main Street. And a depiction of that original schoolhouse was included in a mural in the Forbes building. And it may still be there. I haven't been in there to take a look, but it was on a mural that was there. And the old burying ground, which is shown here, is the first town cemetery. And Nahor Rice, who was a child killed in that Indian raid in 1704, was buried there. So and this gives you some idea, including horse sheds over on the far right, of what the center of town looked like in 1828. Soon thereafter, a major event occurred, which was the railroad came to town, the railroad from Boston to Springfield and further. And the original track layout of that was straight up Brigham Street, right next to the second meeting house, right adjacent to the Rotary. And as you can imagine, this degraded the worship experience for the people who were trying to hold services in the second meeting house, and effectively eventually ended its use for religious services. So this it was quite disruptive when that was where the railroad went through town. So right about this town, as a consequence, the town church further split. The Baptists had already left, but the people in the town church who remained further split along the lines of Trinitarians, who defined God as being Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit, three persons in one, effectively. They formed what was known as the Evangelical Society. The other portion of the congregation were the Unitarians, who held a belief of a single God, not in any way divided in any of its aspects. And they formed what was called the First Congregational Unitarian Society. The reason the societies came to be was that a church per se was unable to enter contracts. It was not a legal entity. So the societies were formed in order to be able to enter contracts, and take money in. They, in turn, owned or built the church buildings. And the funding for the society and the churches were done largely by renting or selling pew spaces within the church. So each of these societies eventually built their own church. The first of these was what I'll call as a home for Trinitarians. This was known as the Third Meeting House, and it's on the site of the current Congregational Church. It was originally a single-story building larger than that second meeting house. After the Civil War, that structure was raised, physically raised up one whole story, and new rooms, meeting rooms, constructed underneath. There were additions of new pews, a new steeple, some stairs on the front, and colored glass replaced the plain glass windows that had been in the original building. About 100 years later, in 1965, the church added an education wing and the Parkman Chapel, which I mentioned before. The society dissolved in 1888 and led to the creation of what is now known as formerly the Congregational Church of Westborough. And that church decided to join the United Church of Christ in 1961. So this business about raising the building, as far as I can tell, there were at least 5 buildings that were raised in this way, raised and or moved. The second and third meeting houses, Parkman's second parsonage was moved up the hill. The first town hall that was built after the second meeting house is no longer used was raised. And the Second Baptist Church, of course, got moved from its site at Lyman Street up to the site of the current Catholic Church. But I'm surprised that there are no photos that I can ever find of how those things were done. It must have been so commonplace. The Unitarians were able to, they tried to use the second meeting house for a number of years, but shortly said, this really is not working. The train disturbance, the state of disrepair forced them to sell the building, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in 1850, they were able to erect and then dedicate their current church building on Main Street. In 1881, there was a chapel and a parlor added, and they needed to rebuild the steeple in 1930, but there was donations and money put forth to do that. And in the early 60s, the Unitarian Society joined the National Unitarian Universalist movement and continue to this day as members of that organization. So one might ask, I'm sure all of you are asking, what happened to the second meeting house? Well, going back a little bit, it turned out not to be big enough as the town grew and the congregation grew. So they really literally split the building and added 14 feet in the middle to make room for more pews and more people. The pictures that I've shown here show a belfry, and that was added in 1801. Breck Parkman, the merchant, bought a small Paul Revere bell and donated it to the town church. And they needed a belfry, so they built a belfry to put that in. Paul Revere bells at that time were kind of like, well, not quite garden variety, but didn't have the historical significance that they later on grew to take. The belfry was also used to house a tower clock that was created by a local watchmaker named Gardner Parker. Parker was an apprentice of the Willards and eventually developed a whole series of valuable historical clocks in his own right. Parker made 3 tower clocks altogether. These were like 4 feet by 8 feet. They had iron gears. They were massive machinery. One of the clocks went to a Shrewsbury church, and that's ended up in Sturbridge Village. A second one went to a church in Arlington, and it was destroyed when the church burned down in 1856. The Westborough clock, once the second meeting house was sold, the belfry was taken down, and that Westborough clock went to the first town hall in 1839, which had to be built in order to replace the meeting house. Until that was replaced by the current town hall. As a result, that clock was lost, literally lost, until 1999, when I understand it was found in the garage behind the Spur House over on Parkman Street. At that point, it was donated to the Smithsonian, and that's where the third Parker clock is today. The Revere bell was loaned to the Baptists first, and then was bought by the Baptists later, and was used in both of their second and third meeting houses and buildings. And in 2017, that Revere bell was sold to the Old South Meeting House in Boston and installed in their belfry in 2017. So the building itself was sold for commercial use. As I said, it was raised one story, and an arcade, a shopping arcade, was added below, and served as a commercial building until 1890, when it was replaced by the arcade building on the Rotary that we know today. So this is what the Rotary looked like in 1875. We're looking up Milk Street. And this is, of course, the arcade building that we know today on that same site. So in 1864, the Methodist congregation was able to organize. In about 1825, the records show that the first sort of self-declared Methodists were known in Westborough. And it's thought that possibly they said, this is the point where if one was part of another church, you no longer had to contribute to the town church. So one suspects that these folks said, oh, well, yeah, we're Methodists, to avoid paying a tax. However, smaller Methodist groups, which were supported by Holliston and Hopkinton churches for several years, began to meet in Westborough after that time. Then the Methodists built their first church on Milk Street in 1864. Now, they proposed initially to build across the street, across Church Street, from what was then became the third meeting house, the Congregational Church. But I think as some evidence of the sway and that those from the former town church continued to have in town even at that point, they were discouraged from building on that site across Church Street from the Congregational Church. And the rationale was that the Methodist leader was a shouting preacher. So the Congregationalists said, he would be disturbing, during their services, they'd be disturbing our services. So the Methodists were persuaded to choose a site for their first church by the railroad on Milk Street, at the site of a former ice house. That's shown in the upper picture here. And you may recognize that building still stands. But they became disappointed with the location by the railroad and somewhat the structure, because of the fact that it was built on the foundation of an old ice house with sawdust in the dirt. And they bought in 1897 a vacant church on Church Street that had been built by the Second Adventists. Second Adventists, by the way, were a movement that gained traction in the 1840s by folks who felt that the second advent of Christ was imminent. They thought it was going to be happening in October of 1843. Turned out they restudied and said, well, actually it's March of 1844. But as sort of that, although that didn't come to pass as far as we know, the roots of that church gave rise to the Second Adventist church that has survived, the Second Advent faith of today. When the Methodists moved into that church, They sold the Milk Street building to the Grange. They raised and turned that Church Street building by 90 degrees because they liked the way it would face better, and used that church until 1968. They then sold that building to the Masons, who continue to use it. And the First United Methodist Church of Westborough was consecrated in their building, their present building, in 1969. And to let folks know, they've just completed an expansion for accessibility and more space this year, and are planning a celebration in the near future for that. So congratulations to the Methodists. Slightly after that, St. Luke's Parish was established here in town. Interestingly enough, the first, one of the early Catholics in Westborough was Timothy Rice. Timothy was one of the Rice boys who'd been captured by the Indians, taken to Canada, integrated into the Indian society, rose basically to be a chieftain, and returned for a while. He was converted to Catholicism in Canada there, returned in 1740 for a brief visit. In the 1850s in the area, there was a growing population of Irish, French, Canadian, and Italian Catholics. But they were denied the use of town hall for their masses and services. So priests from neighboring towns would come in to serve mass in homes. Nonetheless, the St. Luke's Parish was established formally in 1869. And as I noted before, they bought the second church building from the Baptists, moved it from West Main Street to the Milk Street, to an spot on Milk Street near Phillip Street, which is actually now the site of the new fire station municipal building. You have some idea of where that is. It was right next to a major factory. The bad news is that when the factory burned in 1886, it took the church with it. So the Catholics owned land on the site of the present St. Luke's and built a large wooden church, which is shown in the middle picture here, finishing it in 1888. Unfortunately, that also burned in 1921, and the present brick building replaced it. So that's sort of the history of St. Luke's and the parish here in town. Somewhat later, not much later, in 1872, a group of Episcopalians began meeting regularly here in Westborough. The Episcopalians are, the Episcopal Church is a member church of the Worldwide Anglican Communion. It's effectively the Church of England in America. And the church's face, it sees, is known as Via Media, which is a middle way that is effectively both Protestant and Catholic, is their goal. Local worship started in 1872 as an outgrowth of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Southborough. The St. Stephen's congregation bought property at 71 West Main Street in 1899, and the stable on the property was converted to a sanctuary, apparently very, very, very nicely. The present St. Stephen's Church was dedicated in 1957, but their chapel in that church still has the original altar and some of the appointments there on John Street. A good time later, a Lutheran congregation began to form in Westborough, and like in 1960, the Good Shepherd Church congregation was originally part of the Missouri Synod, which was today was a fairly conservative synod, to be honest. They met initially in the Forbes Community Building, and then later met in St. Stephen's Church as they grew. They built their present church on West Main Street in 1967, and there have been numerous additions since. The congregation decided to leave the Missouri Synod in 1976 and in fact joined the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is the predominant Lutheran organization in this country, and became part of the so-called ELCA. And over the last 20 years, the ELCA has joined in what's called full communion with some of the other mainline churches, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, and the Episcopal Church. Full communion is an agreement among those churches that stresses that these churches act ecumenically for the sake of the world. It's a mutual recognition of their baptisms, of communion, the exchangeability of memberships and clergy, and overall a common commitment among those congregations and churches to evangelism, witness, and service. So those are, I think, important steps taken by these churches. In 1987 is the formation of Congregation B'nai Shalom. B'nai Shalom is a Reformed Jewish congregation which actually draws its roots back in, it started in 1973 as a Jewish women, or goes back into 71 as a Jewish women's club, but is yet another example of the mutual support for faith communities in Westborough from one community for others, as we've seen in some numerous other formation of churches here in town. They set up a one-room schoolhouse. They started with 6 children that was set up at the Congregational Church in 1977, and that soon led to the formal establishment of Congregation B'nai Shalom. They bought the Denfield estate as the congregation grew, and eventually constructed the current building on East Main Street in 1987. Today, their congregation includes over 400 families from 20 towns. Quite a growth. In 1990, an independent non-denominational church grew in Westborough. It was, as the term is, planted, this New Hope Chapel, planted by the First Congregational Church in Hopkinton as an outreach ministry. And this is similar to an action that the Congregational Church took to plant or support a new church startup in Waltham. New Hope Chapel held its first worship service in '86, and in 1990 started meeting in the what became known as the 1860 Hall, which was the former Grange Hall, originally the First Methodist Church building. They purchased the building in 1993 and have continued services. In 2001, there was the founding of the Beth Tikva Synagogue, which was originally founded as a conservative Jewish congregation. They moved to a new building in 2001 on 45 Oak Street. But in 2011, the congregation voted to become independent. And in 2019, we're able to add a Beth Tikva Community Center on 30 Oak Street. As an independent congregation, this particular congregation values warmth, inclusiveness, egalitarianism, diversity, full participation, and they support and provide the Beth Tikva Religious School. Soon thereafter, there was a branch of the Chabad organization established in Westborough. Chabad is, as it says here, a 250-year-old branch of Orthodox Judaism. Chabad is an acronym for the 3 major intellectual faculties of the group: wisdom, comprehension, and knowledge. And it's guided by the teachings of 7 successive leaders over that 250-year period known as the Ribbis. Chabad is worldwide. There are 4,000 full-time emissary families and over 3,300 institutions like Chabad of Westborough, which locally meets at 54 South Street. and they're currently working on an expansion campaign. You can see the evidence of that in their picture. More recently, 2007, was the establishment of the Church of the Chapel of the Cross on where I think what the street is, Flanders Road. Yes, it's right there. Started in 1961 with a group of families meeting for Bible study, but grew into sufficient following that they were able to buy land and build this church, Chapel of the Cross on Flanders Road in 2007. They seek to be a people in growing their relationship to learn from Jesus, to love others in the community, and live out the gospel. The church had originally Baptist roots and is now part of Converge Northeast, which is an aggregation of churches. And the congregation continues to be deeply Bible-centric. And the 13th and most recent house of worship added to town is the Sikh temple, the Gurudwara Sahib, also on Flanders Road, next to the Chapel of the Cross. I learned that Sikhism originated in India more than 500 years ago. It is a monotheistic religion that sees one omnipresent but formless God, blending principles of Hinduism and Islam. As noted here, it's the 5th most populous religion worldwide, over 23 million members, 500,000 in the US. The Gurudwara was an outgrowth of the New England Sikh Study Circle, which had its roots in Milford, and now the core membership numbers over 200 families. So a beautiful building that they've added on Flanders Road. So first one, now many. I struggled on this presentation with a big finish. And some people may chuckle at the idea that a talk on religions had a problem coming up with something about to talk about a big finish. But as I thought about it more and more, my feeling is for those of faith, religion is not about big finishes. Rather, religion gives us guidance on living together now, as well as hope for future. And the religions, all of them, speak to constant renewal, and for us on a personal basis, personal new beginnings, not big finishes. So I want to thank you for attending. Turn it back to Kathy, and let's see what kind of questions might have come up during the presentation. Again, thank you very much. I have to get out of this. I have to stop.
Oh, thank you, Tom. That was really incredible. I couldn't get over how you researched so completely all of these different religious institutions, including the formation of the town, which I think is wonderful for people who are new to Westborough or just really have never really known how we got here. And, I just think it's great that you started with the Puritans and came all the way up to the present. I think everybody really enjoyed the presentation. I want to thank you for doing an excellent job. Kudos. I mean, it really, really was wonderful. And for the benefit of the audience, let's see, there's one more comment here. I was just to thank you that someone, that Brenda Lord, really appreciated and enjoyed your presentation.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure, and I thank the Society for the opportunity to enhance the talk and to reach so many people.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just want to mention that our next presentation, our next program is going to be Monday, October 25th it's going to be probably at 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. at Patnick Books, because we have an author. We're going to have Worcester native and author Andrew Noon will be discussing his new historical nonfiction book, Bathsheba Spooner, A Revolutionary Murder Conspiracy, which is a pretty juicy tale, and she lived in Brookfield. And it's a pretty famous story in the at least in Massachusetts history in the Revolutionary War. It should be interesting, and you'll have the opportunity to purchase his book after his presentation. So I hope everyone's enjoyed everything here. Well, yes, you're getting your comments are just you're getting more accolades here. So thank you again, Tom, for your excellently researched program and talk. And I think we all learned a lot, and we can appreciate the diversity of Westborough.
Yes,
Over this year will mark the town's 304th birthday, which is going to be part of our November program. So I'll just use that as a tease. But, it's amazing to see all the changes and the diversity and how much the community has grown. I want to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next month. And thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, Kathy.